We now come to the backbench debate on short-term letting and the sharing economy, and I call Nickie Aiken to move the motion.
Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this House has considered short-term letting and the sharing economy. Mr Deputy Speaker, I have called this debate today in order to once again draw attention to the negative impact on our neighbourhoods up and down the country caused by the abuse of short-term lettings. Short-term lettings are when property is let on a nightly or weekly basis, usually for leisure and tourism purposes, and we are seeing them pop up on a variety of platforms, including AirBnB, Booking.com, TripAdvisor and Expedia. Since the 2015 Deregulation Act, we have seen an increasing number of properties which would have otherwise been rented out on a long-term basis be turned into basically holiday accommodation. Between 2015 and 2020, the number of Airbnb listings alone in London grew by 378%. Research from London councils found that by 2019 there were over 73,000 listings of short-term lets in London across 6 of the largest online letting platforms, equivalent to 1 in every 50 homes in the capital.
Would my honourable friend give way? Would my honourable friend agree with me that one of the issues with short-term lets is that it takes housing stock out of the market? I have the neighbouring constituency of Kensington, and there are streets in particular in the tourist areas round about the South Kensington museums which are almost exclusively now Airbnbs. Many of these are 1- and 2-bedroom properties, which is aggravating the housing crisis because young people who would typically buy these properties simply cannot get access to them.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. She's absolutely right. And with this explosion in the numbers of short-term lettings, we have seen a whole host of problems associated with such lettings becoming more widespread across our neighbourhoods. And I shall come on to highlight a number of the issues that we are seeing, including increased pressure on housing stock leading to a higher property and rent prices, as referred to by my honourable friend for Kensington, a rise in associated antisocial behaviour, noise complaints and dumped rubbish, and an increasing unfair playing field in the accommodation sector, which is placing more and more pressure on hotels and private bread and breakfast businesses. Since coming into force, the Deregulation Act introduced several changes designed to free businesses from the burdens caused by regulation and existing laws, including relaxing planning permission in London on short-term lets. Westminster City Council predicted at the time the bill was going through that homes would be en masse turned into lettings for tourists. We knew that these lettings would soon be turned into basically mini hotels without any oversight or regulation that genuine hotels have to adhere to. This is why it was a relief in some contexts to see short-term lettings in London limited to just 90 nights per year under the Deregulation Act, following a sustained lobbying campaign by Westminster City Council. However, it was not enough, and sadly our worst fears have come to fruition. Without the right tools to enforce this act, our biggest concerns and the reality has really come to fruition for many local people, because many landlords involved in short-term lettings are ignoring the law. Research from 2019 has estimated that 23% of 11,200 Airbnb listings in London alone were occupied for over 90 nights in that year. And with the number of short-term lettings skyrocketing, it is clear that we do need to get a grip of this situation urgently because it is becoming unsustainable. And this is obviously not just a London issue. As my friend, the member for North Devon, recently highlighted in her speech, Devon has seen 4,000 homes come out of private rent and 11,000 join the short-term holiday listings since 2016. And I know from speaking to colleagues from across the country, this is a trend we are seeing up and down the United Kingdom, in particularly in places like Cumbria and the southwest. This is certainly now an issue that affects the whole of our country. I'm aware that whilst the problems such as strain on housing availability and the costs to local authorities may be the same nationwide, the diverse nature of the issue means that there will not be a one-size-fits-all approach to resolving the problem. What we need, in my humble opinion, is for local authorities to be given the powers to do what they feel is right for their unique area. For example, here in Westminster, I would suggest what is needed is a licensing scheme, much like we have seen in other countries around the world. Generally, these schemes are set at a local level and set to ensure that standards are adhered to and that the market is not overwhelmed. We can see from around the world a number of key examples, such as in Lisbon and in Barcelona. In Lisbon, the City Council has implemented containment zones, limiting the number of short-term let accommodation within them. In Barcelona, landlords are required to have their properties inspected and approved before they can be let out. And closer to home, in Scotland, the government there has legislated for local authorities to introduce a short-term lets licensing scheme by October. It will be really interesting to see how this licensing scheme does work when it is implemented and how successful it is. While these schemes I've mentioned differ from one another, they all suit their local needs, seeking to balance the sharing economy with the rights and amenity of local residents. This is what we should be striving for across the UK, balancing tourism with the desire for local needs, for people to have a comfortable and quiet neighbourhood. To build on this point, we have also seen examples around the world that have taken this even further. For example, in Atlanta, in the United States, we have seen the introduction of a tight licensing regime with strict conditions. For example, hosts in that city now have to hold a permit, pay an annual $150 fee, face a $500 fine if a tenant violates city rules, have a maximum of 2 properties, one of which must be the host's permanent residence. I think this is probably what we actually need for London, in my personal opinion. However, what this does show from the examples we've seen across the world is that there is a full spectrum of examples and solutions, and it is about finding what works best in a particular local authority area. As it stands today, the spirit of the Deregulation Act is not being met. We are not seeing a rise of individuals opening their spare rooms or their actual homes whilst they are on holiday, as the government had hoped would happen under the Act. What we are seeing and are continuing to see is a gradual increase of commercial businesses snatching up properties for the short-term letting rental market. Here in Westminster, 64% of hosts on Airbnb have at least 2 listings. And we are also aware that landlords can often skirt... Sorry.
I'm most grateful, and the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to emphasise both the scale of this and the commercial nature of it. I think a lot of people think it's marginal, whereas in fact it's endemic in some areas. I was talking to a local head teacher last week who said her intake to her school has changed because a mansion flat area locally had changed from being long-term temporary accommodation for homeless families into luxury accommodation with a substantial proportion of short-term lets. That's changed the character of the entire area and the demographic of the entire area, and that's why the government needs to act.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I absolutely agree with him. And again, I don't often agree with the member for Hammersmith, but I certainly do on this. We are also aware in Westminster and across central London that landlords can often skirt around the 90-night rule, posting their property on multiple sites or re-registering it in a location a few metres away. In turn, I am deeply worried that we are witnessing a hollowing out of central London, as the member for Hammersmith has just referred to for his local area, as properties convert all too easily from homes into holiday lets. The number of properties listed to rent across London at the start of 2022 was 35% lower than pre-pandemic times. And as I'm sure members will appreciate, the housing market in my constituency and across the capital is already squeezed on both affordability and availability. We currently have over 4,000 households on the Westminster social housing waiting list, in the same area as having 7,230 available properties on Airbnb. We have seen the average house price in the two cities rise by £32,000 per year over the past 25 years. And the most troubling issue for me, according to Spare Room, the average rents have now risen in the capital by 13% within the last year alone. This is why I find it increasingly frustrating that I could easily find plenty of examples of hosts with 50 or even 100 properties available, but I can't find a home to rent on a long-term basis in my constituency within the same areas. This dramatic increase in the number of properties converting to the holiday accommodation market and away from the private rented sector is ensuring that people are forced out of central London. It's getting so bad, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I fear that the only realistic possibility for the young finding a property in central London is perhaps only playing Monopoly. And I don't mean to be that flippant, but it's getting that bad. For those lucky enough to be able to find a property, there is an increasing likelihood you will still find yourself living close to short-term letting properties, no matter where you are. And like I'm sure many of my colleagues have said, this is something that has been reflected in my mailbag from constituents who are finding themselves having to live next door to short-term letting properties.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would she agree with me that there are other attendant problems with short-term lets, such as antisocial behaviour, properties being taken over essentially for large parties, rubbish being put out on the wrong day and littering the street, and sometimes a lack of respect for the neighbourhood?
My honourable friend for Kensington is again absolutely right, and and one of my constituents who wrote to me recently from Pimlico shares her view, and the constituent wrote to me saying there has repeatedly been antisocial behaviour in the Airbnb type flats in Tatsbrook Street in Pimlico. The residents have no interest in the well-being of their neighbours. The flats are without doubt let through the year, and the 90-day rule is completely ignored. Post-pandemic complaints have increased in my constituency, from noise, rowdy parties, serious overcrowding, dumped rubbish, and even sex work occurring within nightly let properties. From Mayfair to Marylebone, from Hyde Park to Covent Garden, no neighbourhood in Westminster in particular is now free from the short-term let blight. On the ground, we have seen some pretty clear signals that short-term lets are increasingly causing social damage for our neighbourhoods. A YouGov study from 2019 found that 40% of Londoners felt that such accommodation was having a negative impact on the local sense of community. And worryingly, it also showed 1 in 5 Londoners, when asked, felt that short-term lets had had a negative impact on safety in their local area. Now, if these properties were rented out just for a few days a year, this might be manageable. However, as mentioned earlier, we know this isn't the case. Local authorities lack the tools necessary to enforce the 90-night rule. As such, complaints are rising, communities are suffering. On antisocial behaviour, yes, the police and local authorities have powers to tackle antisocial behaviour and noise orders. However, we do not always have the information needed to identify those who are involved in those problems. Of course, it is very hard for us to make a generalistic statement about what we would or would not think was a good idea, because it is a complex issue. But as I've said earlier, it is about flexibility. It is about giving local authorities the tools they need to protect their local areas. We have to be practical when it comes to enforcement measures. Right now, what continues to frustrate me, and I know thousands of my constituents, and including councillors and officials at my local council, is that enforcement is virtually impossible to undertake, particularly when we don't know who the person is who is undergoing the antisocial behaviour. We know that the lack of data from local authorities makes it extremely hard for them to identify and then begin enforcement action. What we need is there to be a change in the law to allow local authorities to fine landlords of properties that violate the rules, such as with dumped rubbish. Because at the moment, if the landlord is not responsible, it is the tenant. The tenant's long gone after they've rented out the property for a couple of nights. They've dumped the rubbish, they've gone. What we need is exactly what the former leader of Westminster City Council, Councillor Rachel Rowbottom, called for in response to over 2,000 breaches of short-term letting rules, is to allow councils to go after the tenant, the short-term letter, rather than the landlord. That's what will happen. That's what will help resolve this issue. Mr Deputy Speaker, the issue of tax compliance is also of concern. As the home sharing phenomenon becomes more mainstream, there is also an important taxation revenue stream that needs to be captured. As it stands, it is possible for landlords to hide their activities from HMRC and not tell the truth, perhaps, on their self-assessment forms. If local authorities were able to collect data on what properties are being let out on a short-term lettings basis, HMRC could also then have access to this data and ensure that no one was able to avoid paying tax on any money that they were raising on short-term letting. In 2018, the government actually issued a call for evidence on the role of online platforms in ensuring tax compliance by their users. Since then, there does not appear to have been any major developments in this area. Ensuring property compliance would also go some way to levelling up the playing field with other parts of the tourism economy. As highlighted by UK hospitality, between the short-term lets, hotel and B&B sectors, a regulatory mismatch has also occurred in terms of health and safety and taxation. And I appreciate there is some degree of self-regulation in the industry, but I have seen that this is not enough. Whilst hotels and B&B businesses must go through all sorts of checks and regulations to ensure the safety and well-being of their guests, the same oversight does not exist for short-term letting. For example, while AirBnB insists on things such as insurance indemnity and proper fire precautions, proof they've got the gas and electricity safety certificates, I have met and discussed with actual AirBnB hosts, and they have told me they have not once been asked by a platform to prove they've actually got these requirements. This is why, if we were able to collect tax receipts from short-term lets, they can also and should also be able to help in the enforcement laws. It's not just about it's not just about the tax collection we need to do, but we also need to make sure that these letting landlords are on an equal playing field with bona fide hotels and B&B businesses. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to make it very clear that I am not against short-term letting. I absolutely recognise the many positives, and I have to say that, you know, as an Airbnb user in the past, I have really benefited from being able to rent a home while on holiday. And short-term letting has and does provide an innovative and imaginative competition to the accommodation industry. However, the bottom line is that these positive impacts have also been paired with negative impacts, ranging from lower standards and health and safety issues, unfair competition for other hospitality providers, general economic issues such as missed tax revenues, less long-term rentals availability, also increasing rents and house prices, and ensuring that ordinary local people are priced out of the housing and rental markets in their areas. And this is not just in central London, this is across the UK. And in many cases has ensured that neighbourhoods have changed, as well as other issues such as antisocial behaviour, overcrowding of properties and transient communities. Having a sustainable approach, hopefully in the form of evidence-based, data-driven regulation and policy making, should address some of these issues. As I said earlier, there is no easy fix, no one-size-fits-all approach, but there are certainly stepping stones that we need to look at and introduce. I hope that the Minister, Mr Deputy Speaker, will pay serious attention, not just to what I have said, but more importantly, to what we hear later in this debate from members of all political parties.
The question is, as on the order paper, Karen Buck.
Deputy Speaker, I congratulate my colleague for Cities of London Westminster South, the Member of Parliament for the other part of the Borough of Westminster, and apologise for the fact that we will be covering some of the same ground in terms of locality. But having set up the all-party parliamentary group on short lets, I'm very conscious as well that these are issues that increasingly impact upon cities and popular tourist areas, coastal communities across the country. And I do have to say, although it's always deeply unedifying to stand in Parliament and say, I told you so, the fact is that we told the government so. We warned in the passage of the Deregulation Act in 2015 that the lifting of the the changes in London to allow for the 90-day limit were likely to lead to an explosion of short lets and a very detrimental impact on communities, and that is exactly what has happened. And what has happened, and I remember saying this in debate on that bill and in two subsequent 10-minute rule bills, that residential communities are being turned into unlicensed and unmanaged branches of the hospitality industry. And the Honourable Member for Two Cities has made many of those points. I won't repeat those points, but I will just very quickly kind of reinforce them. As she said, nobody is talking about proposing any kind of ban. The sharing economy concept is a good and a strong one. The idea that people would let out a spare room, that would let out their home for a couple of weeks when they were going on holiday or going abroad to work or whatever, is a very it's a smart idea. It's a popular idea, and it generates money into communities. It generates money for the people who let those properties, and it is clearly popular with the people who rent those properties. The digital economy has created enormous opportunities, and this is one of them. But the actual implementation has changed very, very fundamentally from that original concept. It is now a highly commercial enterprise, and we can see this from the figures. I've previously quoted it say again that a report in 2020 found that just 1/6 of the AirBnB revenue, as a major player in this field, came from the kind of short of home sharing net that was the original concept. And as the Honourable Member has said, the way in which you can track this is the huge shift into whole property rentals. And that has been very significant in London. It's been very significant across the whole of the country. And research that was carried out by Tom Simcock from Edge Hill University found that there was a 423% increase in the number of multi-hosts letting entire properties. So not just individuals, but owners of multiple properties, just giving an indication of how deeply commercialised this sector increasingly is. The impact of this is felt, of course, on the loss of residential property. She's made that point, and I endorse it. We can see a clear indication, because it is financially advantageous to landlords to move out of the the lettings market and into the short let market, where they can make substantially more income, where they are also enjoying significant tax advantages for doing so. So we are finding all over our borough, Westminster, properties that used to be somewhere where people could live are now places that are just used for the holiday industry, and that has all kinds of impacts upon people in housing need, but also on communities. It's also, and has been mentioned, has an impact upon the management of antisocial behaviour, ranging from noise to rubbish nuisance. Again, the kind of thing that were people staying in hotels or registered hospitality, there would be commercial arrangements for waste collection. They would be making a contribution to pay for these things, none of which applies in this instance. This morning, I received an email from a constituent, entirely by coincidence, which I'm now not going to be able to find, but from the from Harrow Road, right? Not in the heart of the West End, but at the very northern and poorer end of my constituency, where I was told that 5 identified properties were now being let into short lets. That people were coming and going with their luggage all through the day and night, that this is causing concerns about security. It's not necessarily that people choose to behave badly, it's not that, but they are particularly acting in an antisocial way. But when people go on holiday, they act differently. And they don't necessarily have the same constraints in terms of the hours they keep, in terms of the kind of the way that they act as people who are residential, and certainly don't necessarily have the same sense of responsibility for security, and it causes a great deal of anxiety. It has been said, and I will repeat again, that local authorities then have their hands tied behind their backs when it comes to enforcing against these lettings, that finding properties that are legally let under the short let arrangements, but have to be acted on when they breach the 90-day rule, is asking local authorities, very cash-strapped local authorities, to do something almost impossible. They have to literally monitor everything. They don't know who's letting, and then when they find out who's letting, they have to be able to prove that that letting was in excess of 90 days. It's completely unreasonable. And landlords, particularly the commercial landlords who see this, the advantage in this arrangement, are driving a coach and horses through the legislation. This is leading to enormous strains in local communities, a great deal of anger amongst neighbours who turned to the local authority to help them enforce it, but the local authority does not really have the capacity to do so. And not unreasonably, the hospitality industry, which has had a terrible couple of years with COVID, also then feels that there is not a level playing field in terms of the arrangements, in terms of their responsibilities from health and safety to taxation, which are being undercut, not by individuals, as I said, not by individuals letting out a spare room, but by major players in the corporate hospitality sector exploiting a loophole. It is absolutely essential that the government wakes up to this. It is spreading across the country, and the implications of it are absolutely profound. Government can act very quickly without an excessive regulatory responsibility, just to make sure that people who let out these properties are licensed to do so, that we know who they are. If we know who they are, then we are in a better position to be able to act when they are in breach of the rules. We have been asking for this for 7 years. It's a cross-party initiative, cross-party in terms of the local authority, cross-party in terms of Parliament. The Minister has to wake up to this and has to act to protect communities and protect us against the loss of valuable residential property before it is too late.
Rachel Maskell.
I'm grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker, and may I congratulate the Honourable Member for Cities of London and Westminster, and also my Honourable friend for Westminster North and their speeches and contribution to today's debate. I want to take the debate outside of Westminster and to highlight the impact that it's having elsewhere in the country. And I think that the thing that it's got in common with members right across the House is this is an industry which is growing at a rapid pace in tourist destinations, and York itself, the most visited place outside of London, is certainly experiencing many of the characteristics which honourable members have described this afternoon. And perhaps The scale is also matched, although we're slightly smaller as a city. But in York, we know that we've got around 2,000 Airbnbs already, predominantly in my constituency. But we know on the outskirts of York as well, it's increasingly becoming an issue in the more rural villages. But certainly in the city centre, we can often find a street where there's 5 or 6 Airbnbs in a family street, and it is certainly having a serious impact. And in fact, everywhere I go across my constituency now, I have constituents coming up to me talking about Airbnbs, holiday lets, or increasingly party houses as they're being called. And that's certainly not within the keeping and the character of our city. And there is this clash of cultures, which is between families that just want to get on with everyday living, with predominantly a weekend culture of parties which is coming. And of course, across the summer, it just never stops. And we're not just seeing this in existing property within the city, but we have increasingly seen new developments coming into York, developers putting predominantly luxury accommodation into the city, but many of these being bought as investments for asset, which I think is an issue we all have with what's happening across some of the property market. And of course, if they're vacant, suddenly the lights go on, well, why don't we turn this into a short-term holiday let? And invariably, we're seeing an increase of that in new estates. And I certainly had concern about this around the proposals for the York Central development, an incredible development, 2,500 homes proposed on that site. And in my discussions with Homes England, there was recognition that this could become a party city landed right in the middle of York, because people locally will not be able to afford to live in those luxury homes, and therefore they will end up just going straight into the hands of many of these companies which are now running the Airbnbs. And of course, these numbers and new developments, they go on to the government's housing numbers. So the government are there ticking off the list saying we've been able to achieve our housing targets, but actually they're just switching over to Airbnbs. And as these, what I'm calling part of the extraction economy, not the shared economy, the extraction economy, as people take that property and wealth out of our city, nobody gains. In fact, everybody loses. And that's why it's really important that government get a grip of this now and bring forward the legislation that is needed to regulate this area, because ultimately these are homes that we desperately need. We all have spoken about the shortage of housing in our constituency. The social housing waiting lists are rising sharply, and the availability of property to buy is just not there. And every single time a property comes onto the housing market, in comes these owners of Airbnb, cash in hand, hoovering up ahead of people that have saved meticulously for their mortgage, and they're offering over the market price for these properties as well. So I heard of one incident in York where they offered £70,000 more than the market price for that property, and as a result people were not able to move in locally. And I speak to young couples and families that are getting increasingly older, as we all know, before you can even think about purchasing a home. And these people are saying that they save and they try and enter into the market, but every time they're beaten to the post by people which then turn over the properties for Airbnb. But it's not only... Oh, I'm happy to.
On a friend, but she's probably seen the advertising. I mean, there was certainly, for a while, there was even advertising on the London Underground saying how much more money people could get by taking advantage of short-term lets, and therefore creating this very, very powerful incentive to do exactly what she's describing.
Well, my honourable friend's absolutely right on that, and a point that I was going to come on to, but I'll come on to it now. So the average rental price in York is very extortionate, not compared to London, but certainly compared to the north, and £945 for private rented accommodation in York. But if on an Airbnb, that same property could go for £700 for a weekend. And as a result of that, what we are seeing is now a frenzy amongst landlords who are saying, actually, I could get a lot more money out of an Airbnb property, so I'm going to issue a Section 21 notice, evict my current tenants, and then turn that property over to an Airbnb. And of course, as a student city, we have 40,000 students in York. Many of the homes within student areas are also turning themselves over to Airbnb, which means we then have a shortage of student accommodation as well as local people not being able to get into housing. So it is escalating the impact that is happening in the city. And some of these places, the way that they're marketed as well, it's not just as a holiday let. We've got some which are deliberately being marketed for stag and hen parties. And this now is becoming an issue which is not only impacting on our city centre, but then is those parties being taken out into the community. I've got one cul-de-sac in the Groves in York where they have 3 of these Airbnbs in a little courtyard, and they advertise for 30 people to go and spend their weekend there. Now, this is at the end of a kind of family residential street, and what people in my community have told me is that the noise goes on all night. These are working people, you know, they're working shifts and got a job to do. Children sitting exams, or at this time of year, or perhaps you know, going to school but having sleepless nights. And then on top of that, the profane language which is being used, which obviously they're trying to shelter their children from, people kind of half-clad out in the streets, women not feeling safe down some of the back alleys in the Groves, which are where a lot of children play. It's just turning these wonderful little communities within York into these nightmares where actually people are not feeling safe in their own home anymore. In fact, I heard from one family that put their house on the market and they've moved out of the city because that was the only way they could escape the party houses which were increasingly in their area. And of course, they wrote to me about the impact that was having. But as we're seeing the increase in Airbnbs, what we are seeing clearly is a disappearance of the ability of York to house its own local community. And that's having a severe impact on the local economy as well. So we've heard about the tourism sector, but traditional B&Bs are losing out, not only because they follow all the rules and they pay their duty and you know, they follow health and safety and all the other areas, but they're in direct competition, and because of course they're covering their costs, then they themselves are being pushed out, guest houses the same, and therefore what we are seeing is a deregulation of the whole of the visitor economy, which of course doesn't bring benefit to a location, but also has serious implications for local businesses. And I challenge those that say this is good for the economy, because I think what we're seeing is an extraction economy. So many of the people purchasing the houses in York aren't from York. They're from London and the South East predominantly. So they're seeing the opportunity, and holiday destinations have no connection to those communities, and therefore taking out of those communities, not feeding into them. And when I hear that the expectation is there's going to be a rise of 30% per year for the next decade of Airbnb properties, and that's by Airbnb's own research which they carried out, that fills me with terror. And that's why I say to the Minister, it's really important that we get on top of this issue now, because this is going to make it far worse year by year across our communities. And of course that then fuels our housing crisis even more, which is going to give him the biggest headache of all, as we're standing up here saying that we need this addressing. And I know the Minister's interest and work around social housing, but what we are also seeing is some of these people going cash in hand along the line of right to buy and saying, if you buy your home and go through that process, we will be back and we can then give you even more money in exchange for your property. So this is why we need it regulating, and regulating really tightly. It's also having a profound impact on our community and services in the city as well, and often something that isn't particularly thought about. But our economy is now struggling to recruit the very people it needs to work in it. So because of it's escalating and fueling the housing crisis, it's impacting on care work, it's impacting on NHS staff, being able to find property in the city, it's impacting on the hospitality sector. And of course, all these people coming to our city often use those services and they want their hospitality venues open in order to utilise them. And they can't recruit staff because the people who particularly would have been in those properties can't afford to live in the city anymore, and therefore they're being pushed out. So it's having this kind of negative impact, not just on the housing environment, but also on the local economy. So the deregulation system is not working. We've heard about the impact that this has on children as well. And because of the issuing of Section 21 notices and the community itself, children are then having to leave their schools and go elsewhere. So that's having a negative impact right across the area. And we've heard about the kind of weekends of misery that people have when a Friday comes. People don't know who's going to come off the train with their trolley bags and wander up their street, and whether they're going to have a peaceful weekend or a party to endure. And of course then the other antisocial behaviour that goes with that, and it is really quite horrific, some of the things that I've heard. This isn't what our city is about, and it's not what my local people want our city to be about in the future, and that's why we need to address it. But also, as the honourable member for the two cities in London mentioned, there's a loss of revenue as well, and local revenue. So in York we're losing about 2 million in council tax, and many of these escape under the bar in being a small business, so they're not paying small business rates. And across the country we don't have that 90-day limit either, so we're talking throughout the year that real loss and the implications that it's having. And this has escalated in York during the pandemic. York has been seen as that 2 hours away from London, amazing city to live in, good schools, all the rest of it, fantastic place. But people have then realised, but it's also a really good destination for staycation. And that's been incredible for our recovery, and I'm not knocking that at all. It has been incredible. But what people have also seen is the chance over the lockdown period, but particularly since, in order to then come and invest in Airbnbs. And that's why we're seeing this sudden growth in the city, and it has taken the city by shock and surprise, and having that negative impact there. Now, I know government have been out on a path to look at a registration scheme around Airbnbs, and I don't knock government for that, but the world has changed very rapidly, and I would just say to the government that we need to move on from that now to look at a full licensing scheme, because a registration scheme simply would have serious deficiencies in it. And we've heard about the benefits of a licensing scheme, looking at Lisbon, Scotland introducing that, and I would also point the Minister towards Nice, which has a very stringent licensing scheme, but it works incredibly well for those residents. And a licensing scheme could help local government, first of all, have sufficiency in resourcing to support this. And I think particularly around, and I know the honourable member for somewhere in the Lake District, North and South, I think both honourable members have mentioned about having a different class of housing, so that you could actually charge a separate revenue from that. But even looking at doubling council tax or even a multiplier on council tax at the local authority's discretion could be one way of looking at how you can build that revenue back into your local area. Of course, you'll then pay for those services, which they currently aren't, like refuge collection, even parking schemes, which impacts on areas. But you can also limit housing, and I think we've heard from honourable members how advantageous that would be to a local area as well. But also having, in Nice, they have a very strict fines regime around where there is significant antisocial behaviour, but also the right to remove licences, the right to grant licences, and looking at how they can place conditions on licensed properties. So I think there would be real advantage about not government holding those powers, but giving those powers to local communities through their local authority. And indeed, it will make landlords themselves have more responsibility as well, and for the properties that they let off and let through a third party and agency, but also would bring in some greater controls. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I may just look at the kind of speed in which we need to bring this in. We've got the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill before Parliament at the moment. Now it talks about opportunities around things like second property reform, and for many people, as we've heard, this is not just about the second property, the third property or fourth property. I've heard that there's some which have over 100 properties. This is a very highly organised industry, but it would seem inappropriate that government could put an amendment down, a new clause in that bill, to look at this issue and really address the matters before us, because if we don't act now, the housing issues which the Minister and his team are trying to resolve, which are complex and growing, are going to just get worse and worse for him. And therefore, I would really welcome more discussion with government about how we're going to move this rapidly into legislation to end this nightmare for our residents. And perhaps I could suggest to the Minister, if we think across the House the number of members that this really does impact on our communities, perhaps holding a round table with us so we can discuss these issues at length, because I think across the House we all share the view of what we need to achieve, and I'm sure that we can find the right solutions for government and for our communities.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like many other aspects of our online lives, this started as a good idea. Take a list of people who want short-term accommodation and use the internet to match it with a list of people who can provide it. Unfortunately, though, what we see today has become a grotesque distortion of the original idea. And in particular, as has been mentioned, the vast majority now of properties that are being offered as short-term lets are not spare rooms in somebody's houses. They are being offered on a commercial basis as whole properties. And that is something that I think is regrettable, because in fact this process has become a driver for the removal of accommodation from the private rented sector into the short-term let market, catering for mainly for leisure uses, and it has had appalling consequences in the local housing market as a result. And what we have now is, in effect, operators operating unlicensed hotels, but rather than the accommodation being in one building, it's spread throughout an entire community in a pepper pot fashion. Now, this is a problem throughout Scotland, but it affects some parts more than others. The Highlands in particular has a very great problem. But probably the biggest problem of all is in our capital city in Edinburgh, which is the city I'm proud to represent in this House. Fully 1/3 of all the Airbnb listings in Scotland were in the city of Edinburgh in 2019. In some of the wards, particularly in the city centre wards, 1 in 5 of all accommodation is listed on Airbnb. 1 in 5. And that's just Airbnb, by the way. There are other operators. So actually, the scale of the penetration of short-term lets in Edinburgh city centre is probably even greater than that. By the end of the last decade, this had reached crisis proportions, which is why the city authorities, and working with the Scottish Government, decided to act. And I want to say something about that in a minute, but I just want to mention before, to reiterate some of the consequences of this process for what has happened in my local community. The first is that with this penetration of up to 1 in 5 properties being available for short-term lets, has come a hollowing out of the local community, particularly in some of our historic areas that we want to see thrive. It's impossible, Mr. Speaker, to get to know your neighbours if they change every week. And the people who come, who used to be people who lived there on a permanent basis, they no longer send their kids to local schools. They don't even use the local shops because they tend to arrive and then get the supermarket delivery coming to the door afterwards from out of town. So they play no role in building the local economy, no role in community cohesion, And then as a double whammy, the other consequence is that they provide a great deal of disturbance and inconvenience to people who are left to live there as well. And I have had repeated casework from people coming to me. In fact, even just this week, local councillor Finlay McFarlane brought to me a case of a resident who's lived off the Royal Mile for more than 20 years and is currently finishing her PhD thesis and is unable to do so because most of her block is now short-term lets where people are coming in to have parties on weeknights as well as weekends, and with the constant confusion and noise and disturbance that results, it's become, in her words, almost uninhabitable. And this is a common problem. And the other consequence, as well as the loss of homes, is I do feel there's a great deal for a city like mine that relies a lot on tourism and where tourism is very important. I've had a number of bona fide hotel operators come to me and point out that what is actually happening is that people on a commercial basis are running unlicensed hotels without having health and safety standards, without having all of the other requirements they are required to do, and without paying taxes, and they are being undercut as accommodation providers by people using the short-term let sector. So it's grossly unfair and distorting the tourism market as well. Now, as has been referenced, we are trying to do something about this in Scotland. The law changed last year, and from the 1st of March, the law has come in to create a new framework for the operation of short-term lets in Scotland, which my own city is determined to take advantage of. The key thing is to bring in a licensing framework, with the local authority being the licensing body, where in order to operate a let on a short-term basis, one requires a licence. That will be the law from the 1st of October this year for anybody trying to enter the market as a new operator. And by 2024, it will be a requirement for everybody operating a short-term let to have such a licence. And it will be unlawful if they do not have it. But there's another important component to the legislation in Scotland as well. And that is the ability of local authorities to ask for permission to designate a short-term let control area within their boundary, where there is a particular need for housing stress or where there is a particular problem of abuse. And the City of Edinburgh Council has taken the unusual step, I think, of asking the Scottish Government to designate the entire city as a control area. That is a decision which the Council took with every party on the local authority supporting it, and after an extensive consultation involving 5,600 responses, where more than 88% of those respondents said that is what they wanted. And so the Scottish Government has agreed to that. And what that means, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that in order to take a property which is not currently let on a short-term basis and decide to do so, you will not just require a licence, you will require planning permission. And one would have to apply for and get a change of use planning consent as a condition of getting the licence if you are in a controlled area. So that is what is going to be happening in Edinburgh. It will take some time because it is important, as with other matters, that planning decisions are consistent with the local development plan. And therefore they have to be evidenced and backed up by that. So we do need to make amendments to that, and we need to get that bedded in. But I am confident that in the years ahead, we will be able in my city to get control of this. And if these measures don't work, I can assure you there's an appetite for going further and making sure that we get other measures that do. And just in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll reiterate what colleagues have said on a cross-party basis. This is not a matter of saying there shouldn't be short-term lets or trying to, to do down people who want to rent out a spare room. Far from it. It's simply saying that if people wish to do this on a commercial basis, then they have to play on a level playing field with the same obligations and the same consequences as anybody else who tries to run a business. And they have to take cognizance and be respectful of the local community and the conditions in which they're trying to make that money. And I hope the situation will improve dramatically in Edinburgh and in Scotland, and I would commend these measures to the UK government. They may want to consider following Scotland's lead and doing this in other parts of the UK where it is so urgently needed.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first congratulate the Honourable Member for Cities of London and Westminster for securing the debate, and also for her opening speech, which I thought set out the issues really well. And we've also had excellent speeches from my honourable friends from York Central and Westminster North. And what's been noticeable, as we've just heard, is the consensus here. We may be small in number, but I think we all recognise the issue, recognise that it needs to be tackled. And the fact that there aren't many people here maybe is because it's not a controversial proposal, this. Mr Deputy Speaker, Britain is a fantastic country with a wealth of exciting places to visit. Our remarkable cultural heritage, our world-class attractions and events, our incredible scenery, our coastal towns and vibrant cities, and our amazing capital city. But the tourism sector has really suffered as a result of the pandemic, and its recovery has been much slower than other sectors. Visit Britain found that the UK's tourism sector lost a total of £146 billion over 2020 and 2021. That's around £200 million a day. The UK's tourism sector is recovering at a slower rate than Europe and the USA. We have tourism recovery plan targets and a review of destination management organisations gathering dust on the shelf. Despite this, we know we will recover. People are already returning to big events. In Manchester, we had one of our biggest weekends ever last weekend, with lots of huge events around the city, hotel rooms packed, bars packed, Airbnbs packed. And the inbound tourist trade is picking up as well. And domestic or tourist visitors want somewhere affordable and convenient to stay. And short-term lets have helped many people to do this, encouraging people to holiday domestically within the UK and housing people from abroad. And generally, that's generally good, notwithstanding the difficulties for some hotel operators that were identified by a friend from Edinburgh East. And we want those holidays, those visits, those day trips to continue and to grow. But short-term letting is only a good thing if it's sustainable and it strengthens rather than weakens communities. And as we've heard today, in many places, housing supply, local services, safety and well-being are being affected by the trend towards short-term lets. Properly managed, short-term lets can have real benefits. They can increase housing options, especially at peak time. And I've used Airbnb for Labour Party conference accommodation, so I know how it can add capacity when all the hotels are packed out for conferences. It can ensure that empty rooms can be used efficiently, and it gives people an opportunity to make a little extra money. But a residential property that's being used for Airbnb, and I use Airbnb as a kind of shorthand, but they are clearly the market leader in this area, can cause the kinds of issues for residents that we've heard about today and been so well articulated, and can take that property out of the residential property housing market. Yes, happy to give away.
I thank him for giving way. He mentions Airbnb. In the town of Deal that I represent, there's been a particular problem of Airbnbs that are not registered. Does he agree with me that actually having a registration system for Airbnbs would be a very sensible move to protect coastal communities and tourism in areas like mine?
I was hugely generous, and so was the front bench spokesman in allowing that intervention for obvious reasons. Jeff Smith.
I think she makes a really important point. I'm going to come on to registration, but yeah, we need to look at the options clearly. So we've heard about those kind of the problems that are caused, residents citing health and safety concerns, with temporary residents not being familiar or not caring about safety rules. There are issues with short-term rentals being used for parties. We've heard about the noise and the antisocial behaviour. But the longer term, and I think probably the most significant concern, is around the sustainability of communities when too many residential properties become short-term lets. I'll talk about that in a second. In London, as we've heard, the law currently allows short-term letting of residential properties for a maximum of 90 nights in a calendar year without planning permission. Since 2017, Airbnb has automatically limited entire home listings in Greater London to 90 nights per calendar year, as we heard earlier, to encourage compliance with that law. By February 2020, two similar platforms, HomeAway and TripAdvisor, had also implemented a cap, and the Mayor of London has encouraged other platforms to do the same. But there are easy ways around these rules, as we heard earlier, and many properties are still being let out on a short-term basis for more than the permitted 90 nights. When the 90-night limit is exceeded illegally, these issues are compounded and likely to grow and grow. Outside of London, of course, there's no specific limit on how long a property can be let out on a short-term basis, and it's up to local planning authorities to judge whether the use of a letting amounts to a material change of use and requires planning permission. And it's difficult because, as well as the difficulties that we've talked about caused to residents, the complaints about antisocial behaviour are putting pressure on local authorities, as my honourable friend pointed out, and they're already overstretched resources following years of Tory and coalition government cuts to local authorities. It's putting huge pressure on the local enforcement teams. So, as we heard, the honourable member for the two cities is calling for the introduction of a licensing scheme, making it mandatory for anyone to rent out their property on a short-term basis to have to register it. And that would make it easier for local authorities to tackle some of those issues and the law-breaking that might arise. And I do want to pay tribute to my honourable friend from Westminster North for her consistent campaigning on this issue, her work over a number of years, and calling on the government to give local councils more powers to manage how properties are used for short-term rentals. And I think these are all proposals that need to be looked at very seriously by the government. I know from my own constituency in South Manchester the problems that occur when houses become party-let houses. It used to be that in my area it was on the student HMOs that became party houses and became a real problem for long-term residents. And now lots of our houses are rented out by Airbnb and causing real difficulties for the long-term residents, the noise, the litter, the disturbance. And my honourable friend from Edinburgh talked about control zones. When I was a councillor in Manchester, we introduced an Article 4 direction to limit the number of HMOs that could be permitted in an area. And that kind of innovative approach, I think we certainly need to look at, and be interesting to see how the control zones in Edinburgh work and how we can learn from that. So as well as those kind of problems, the problems that I'm experiencing in my constituency and in other urban areas, the prominence of second homes and short-term lets is causing a housing and public services crisis in popular tourist destinations across some of the more rural parts of the UK. From Cornwall to Cumbria, from Northumberland to the West Country, Shropshire, parts of Yorkshire, the Scottish Highlands, as we've heard, and rural Wales have all suffered. In order to thrive, rural communities need investment, they need employment opportunities, and in many cases they need thriving tourism industries, but they also need affordable homes for local people. Accelerated by the pandemic, many of these areas have seen house prices soar and availability drop as wealthy outsiders buy up second homes, often for buy-to-let. And then they discover that owners can often get more money from short-term let than from a long-term tenant. Previously permanent rental properties are being turned into Airbnb holiday lets, and that's got a direct impact on the affordability and availability of local homes, particularly for local first-time buyers and private renters. And it also means that houses are left empty for large chunks of the year, reducing their permanent populations. Now that can have pretty disastrous impacts on the local community. School closures, because families are forced out and schools become unsustainable. Cuts to transport services and buses, health and other services disappearing as demand for them drops. And it seems pretty clear that the government need to explore whether and how local authorities can be provided with the powers to tackle this issue. We've heard a few examples. We can introduce licensing regimes for second homes and short-term lets. Consider giving councils greater discretion over council tax regimes. They can look at allowing local authorities to levy more premiums or surcharges on second homes and long-term empty properties if they believe it's needed in their locality. Some local authorities are backing calls for more powers in planning to recognise short-term rentals as a different use class, meaning that people who want to use their home exclusively for Airbnb would need planning permission. And all these are a number of ways that local authorities can control how their local areas operate. So it's welcome that the government committed to launching a consultation on the introduction of a tourist accommodation registration scheme in England. But so far, we've seen no sign of it. It was promised in early 2022. I think in mid-June, it would probably past early 2022. So I'd be very happy if the Minister can today confirm when the consultation will open and how long it's going to run for. And while we continue to wait for it, I welcome the news that the Labour Mayor of London has just launched his own consultation on this issue, and I'd encourage everyone affected by this in London to participate before it closes on the 4th of July. The rise of Airbnb is just one example of the emergence of the sharing economy, Many businesses have become everyday fixtures of our modern lives. At their best, these platforms can be about reducing waste, about pooling space, skills and items, and making life easier and more sustainable. But it doesn't always work like that. When it becomes commercial, it can really cause difficulties. When Airbnb and similar websites first emerged, it was about individuals occasionally making a bit of extra income on their spare room or own property. But things are very different now. A large part of the short-term rental market is now a wholly commercial enterprise. Residential properties being used as letting businesses without the required planning permission and local authority oversight or protections for neighbours and communities. And we clearly need to respond now to that different context. So let's learn from the examples we've heard about from abroad. Let's look at the changes in Scotland and elsewhere. Airbnb have said that they're willing to work with the government on regulation to ease some of the challenges that they are contributing to. I know they published a healthy tourism commitment and their own short-term lets registration white paper, which actually also again calls for the introduction of a simple nationwide registration scheme for the short-term letting sector. So the willingness is there from stakeholders. The political imperative is there, I would argue. The political consensus is there that we need to get a grip of this, and the need is certainly there, as we've heard very well articulated today. So it's now time for the government to act, to start to tackle this issue and to get the balance right for our communities. Thank you.
Minister Eddie Hughes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, good to see you in the chair. I'd like to begin by thanking the Honourable Member for Cities of London and Westminster for the opportunity to debate this important issue. I know this is a matter of considerable interest to many honourable members across all parties, and I'm grateful to have heard some of their contributions today. While short-term and holiday letting to paying guests is not a new phenomenon, it's clear that there has been rapid and significant growth in the market over the last decade or so, driven by the proliferation and popularity of online platforms like Airbnb. Madam Deputy Speaker, other platforms are available. Many honourable members will have seen firsthand and will have heard indeed from their constituents as to the challenges and, on occasion, the benefits that this growth has brought to communities, to the tourism industry and to the wider housing market. Today's session has been an invaluable opportunity to hear about the picture in different areas of England and indeed Scotland. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think we can all agree that the sharing economy does make an important contribution to the wider economy. Some estimates suggest that the short-term let hosts and guests contribute over £3 billion to the UK economy. The sharing economy also benefits consumers who are not able to enjoy a greater choice of accommodation and at a range of competitive prices. And obviously for households who have unoccupied or underused accommodation, it provides an additional source of income. And of course, an increased number of tourists in any area will have a positive knock-on effect for local businesses, particularly tourism and hospitality businesses, who will see more footfall and more spending. But despite the myriad benefits I've outlined, there are major drawbacks for certain local areas, as members have highlighted today. And it's particularly an issue in hotspots like my honourable friend's constituency, the Cities of London and Westminster, but also, as the honourable lady member for York Central highlighted, in York as well, and in rural areas such as the South West and in the Lake District, as the honourable member for Edinburgh highlighted, in Edinburgh too. It's been argued that the growing number of short-term lets is impacting housing supply, with some people rightly concerned that landlords may be prioritising short-term letting activity instead of long-term tenancy arrangements. As a government, we've published today a white paper for private renters entitled A Fairer Private Rented Sector, which sets out our plan to fundamentally reform the sector and level up housing quality in this country. Our hope, obviously, is that this package of measures should help good landlords in the market. Another concern with short-term and holiday lets has been reports of noisy neighbours, antisocial or nuisance behaviour of guests. Indeed, the Greater London Authority has reported that in the 5 London boroughs with the most Airbnb listings, there have been complaints related to short-term letting activity, with Westminster reporting 194 complaints of noise, waste and antisocial behaviour over the course of just 1 year. Local authorities do have a range of powers to enable them to tackle these kinds of issues, including being able to serve abatement notices if they believe a statutory nuisance is taking place, powers to tackle noise under the Noise Act 1996, and powers under the Antisocial Behaviour and Policing Act 2014 to act on nuisance such as litter and garden rubbish, as well as noise. We know also, and we've heard from my honourable friend, that in London a further issue is that some short-term lets are regularly in breach of that 90-day rule that we've heard about. I know she has done a valiant job of lobbying Airbnb to take an industry lead and has encouraged them to accept a registration scheme, provide local authorities with full disclosure of their properties in their area and enforce that 90-night rule. For those unfamiliar, if London properties which are liable for council tax are let out for more than 90 nights a year, this represents a material change of use for which planning permission is required. This rule was introduced through the Deregulation Act 2015. It gave Londoners similar freedoms to residents in the rest of England where there are no restrictions. Prior to 2015, Londoners couldn't let out their home on a short-term basis. It means that Londoners can rent out their property when, for example, they're away on holiday. But as we've heard, in practice, local authorities say they're struggling with enforcement on any breaches because of a lack of data on where the lets are located and who runs them. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this brings me on to what steps the government is taking to improve how the short-term letting sector operates. There is currently no definitive source of data on short-term lets, and much existing evidence is largely anecdotal. It's also the case that much of the publicly available data predates COVID-19, so we really need to get an up-to-date picture of how the market is operating today. So in the very near future, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport therefore intend to publish a call for evidence to help us do precisely that. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, after this debate, when I see the Minister in the tea room, I'll be nudging him in the right direction. Getting an up-to-date picture of how the market is operating will be vital to developing appropriate ways forward that not only preserve the benefits of short-term letting, but address the challenges too. When the call for evidence is published, the government will welcome responses from those who have spoken today, so that, when working out what the government should do next, we can take advantage of the valuable knowledge imparted today. Of course, give way.
Giving way, it's my understanding that DCMS are going to be looking at a registration scheme and not a licensing scheme, and there is a world of difference between that. Perhaps with his own department's interest in this issue as well, there could be a round table to discuss the impact and the difference between licensing and registration. Would he advocate facilitating such a round table with, for instance, members here and members with a particular interest in this issue?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if I can facilitate, but trust me, I'm definitely going to advocate. I think the idea of a round table with the relevant ministers from my department and DCMS would be an excellent idea. That would give colleagues from across the House the opportunity to engage, and it would be delightful if the Honourable Member for Edinburgh West East could contribute to it as well. I fully appreciate the jurisdiction element, but it would still be good to have his input. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, another prominent call is for changes to the planning system. I recognise that the creation of a new class for short-term lets appears to be an attractive way to limit them. However, this would also create challenges in terms of how a new use class would be applied and effectively enforced. That being said, I know the Scottish Government have made changes to their planning system, and the Welsh Government are consulting on making changes to reflect the new world created by short-term holiday lets. I would remind members participating in this debate that the spread of second homes and holiday lets across England is not a consistent picture, and it clearly varies region by region. Nevertheless, we're speaking with the Welsh Government about the progress of their planning proposals and their implementation, and I can assure members that in this area we'll keep this under review. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also want to briefly touch on the action the government is taking through the tax system. The government has strengthened the criteria under which second properties are considered as commercial holiday let and assessed for business rates rather than council tax. From the 1st of April next year, holiday lets will be required to demonstrate that they have actually let out their property for at least 70 days in the preceding year. This will ensure that only genuine holiday businesses which bring tourists to destinations across the country and contribute to the economy can access the rate of relief for small businesses. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's debate has also touched on the impact that short-term lets have on the housing market. So I want to mention what steps the government is taking to address the challenges in our housing market. This includes making the dream of home ownership a reality, as well as delivering a significant number of new affordable homes so that everyone can access a safe and secure home that is affordable to them. We're investing £11.5 billion in the affordable housing programme, which, if economic conditions allow, will provide up to 180,000 homes across the country. We're also adopting new measures to support people getting onto the housing ladder. Since 2010, over 758,000 households have been helped to purchase a home through government-backed schemes, including Help to Buy and Right to Buy. On top of this, our First Homes programme offers homes to local first-time buyers with a discount of at least 30% from the full market value. Local authorities also have the discretion to apply additional eligibility criteria to first homes through the plan-making process, including deeper discounts of 40 or 50%, where buyers can demonstrate a local connection in order to prioritise local residents and key workers. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to close by once again thanking my honourable friend for bringing this important debate to the House. An issue that the Government is acutely aware of, and I can assure colleagues, one that we are paying close attention to and giving careful consideration to both in my department and in DCMS. As highlighted at the outset, we do recognise that the sharing economy can be beneficial for local communities and businesses, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're equally clear that these benefits cannot come at the expense of our ultimate priority of ensuring that everyone has access to a decent, safe and affordable home.
Nickie Aiken.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank all members who spoke here today. There may have been few of us, but I think quality rather than quantity was very clear in the speeches that we heard. The member for Westminster North, obviously she and I have worked on this issue for several years, particularly since the Deregulation Act, so we know the effect of that short-term letting is having on our borough of Westminster in particular. And she highlighted Airbnb type short-term letting in Harrow Road, one of the poorest areas in Westminster, and social housing being abused like this. I'd like to thank the member for York Central, who highlighted another tourist area where short-term letting is having an effect on the local community, and that it's affecting local people, and that this is why we have got to have some sort of scheme, registration scheme or licensing scheme that local authorities can use then to tackle the abuses of short-term lets. And I was really interested to hear from the member for Edinburgh East on what is happening in Edinburgh, a city very close to my heart, where I was brought up in Edinburgh, and I know, particularly in the summer, in August, where Edinburgh becomes a tourist hotspot, and we've got to really ensure that we can protect the local people who live in the areas 12 months a year. And I will be fascinated, and I will be keeping an eye on what is happening in Edinburgh, because I do think that is probably one of the answers for places like Central London, a licensing scheme that is being introduced in Edinburgh. As I've said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not anti-Airbnb, this is not anti-short-term lets, this is about being pro-local areas and ensuring that key workers can remain in areas where there are in tourist hotspots, and that people who live in these areas for 12 months a year have got the quality and the amenity that they deserve. And that I'm sure with a registration or a licensing scheme for those local authorities who want them, then I think that we can protect our neighbourhoods and ensure that they remain pleasant places to live.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order papers. Now, is that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you.